Hello, folks, and welcome to our new energy seminar today. I know that folks are still coming into the room, so I'm going to just get us off to a modest start here. My name is Amanda Graham. I am the academic director for the Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth College, and it has been our great pleasure to shepherd and host this series, the New Energy Conversations with Early Career Energy Researchers. The program has had hundreds of participants. We have had dozens of speakers, and the idea really is to ensure that scholars who are developing in the energy and climate and society space, advanced doctoral students, postdoctoral students, and early stage assistant professors have a venue in which to share their work on emerging energy and climate issues, across multiple disciplines. And so we have been really delighted to host this series of seminars. And this is our final seminar of our fall term at Dartmouth College. You will want to keep an eye out for our winter term series that will kick off in January. So we'll keep you posted on more information on that if you check our website. But for today, I am really delighted to welcome two distinguished speakers to our forum. As you see from the slide in front of you, our main speaker today will be Camillo Stubenberg from Cornell University. And the focus of his talk is on a particular case in Lebanon. And I'm really delighted to introduce our moderator for today, Chad Elias. Chad is associate professor in art history at Dartmouth College. And because Chad has spent much of his research focus looking at Lebanon from another set of perspectives. Chad teaches the course at Dartmouth College on energy and society in the Middle East and North Africa. He published his first book, Posthumous Images, Contemporary Art and Memory Politics in Post-Civil War Lebanon. And so he and Camillo both know the area really well, and they're taking the conversation from this multidisciplinary perspective. You'll hear about Camillo's background in a minute, but it's very different from Chad's background in art history. And I just love the opportunity for us to bring those multiple perspectives to bear on a particular region and its opportunities and challenges in our energy and climate transitions. So without further ado, let me hand the mic over to Chad Elias to get us started. And thank you so very much for being here today.
Hi, everybody. It's really great to be here. Thank you, Amanda, for those words. It's definitely a pleasure to be introducing Camillo today. I think his research is absolutely fascinating and certainly politically urgent in terms of being able to think about the implications of grid collapse in a nation like Lebanon. What are the political and social factors, as well as the kind of infrastructural factors that led to an energy crisis in the country? What can we learn from that? And of course, what kind of alternatives exist out there in terms of being able to move to a different system to be able to transition towards, for instance, renewable energy sources. Just as a way to kind of preface today's talk by Camillo, I wanted to just talk a little bit about energy transition as a concept, because I think it's a fascinating area of research that obviously spans many disciplinary boundaries. In simple terms, we can think about energy transition as referring to the shift from reliance on traditional fossil fuels to more sustainable energy sources such as solar power, wind power, hydropower, and certainly recent innovations in renewable energy production, storage, and distribution have made energy transition more economically viable. But there are still enormous obstacles to the implementation of these technologies. I teach a class on energy and society at Dartmouth that looks at some of the real challenges of energy transition from various disciplinary lenses or perspectives, including political science, but also really thinking about different energy cultures. I want to just highlight quickly a framework from political science, because I find this quite interesting, which is a theory of path dependence that argues that resource abundancy and infrastructural investments can lock a society into a particular energy trajectory. So, for example, existing fossil fuel infrastructure such as electricity grids, industrial facilities, and transportation systems make it really difficult for nations to transition to cleaner energy sources without sunk costs and some element of social disruption. So overcoming this kind of lock-in requires substantial innovation, not only at the kind of technological levels, but also the political and economic levels. There's an interesting kind of argument that I'm wondering if Camillo will explore today, which suggests that smaller, less developed nations might have certain advantages because they can adopt clean energy technologies without the need to necessarily replace an extensive and well-established fossil fuel infrastructure and political economy, certainly like the one that exists in the US, that is, a very sedimented and fossil fuel intensive energy infrastructure. Now, having said that, I think it's important to recognize, and I'm sure Camillo will discuss this, that Lebanon faces significant energy challenges that are bound up with a number of systemic problems that include political corruption, clientelism, weak state capacity, rampant inflation, poor infrastructure, poor energy infrastructure in particular, and a heavy reliance on imported fossil fuels. Lebanon is an energy poor nation. So I just wanted to pose just a couple of questions before we hand it over. Can successful energy transition happen in the absence of a stable and legitimate state? They can incentivize the use of renewable energy through subsidies, tax incentives, and emission reduction targets. Is energy transition something that can be citizen-led and achieved through grassroots initiatives financed by the private sector rather than the state? And lastly, how might other nations learn from the Lebanese experiment? So welcome to Camillo, and I'm just going to finish up there. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. I will share my screen. I hope I'm audible. Okay. All right, just a brief feedback. Is my first slide visible?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. All right.
There it is.
Okay. Thank you so much. Here we are. Thank you so much, firstly, Chad, for your generous introduction, as well as your questions at the outset, some of which I think will, you can sort of maybe deduce answers to through my presentation. A big thank you also to Amanda and the Irving Institute, and particularly to Megan, who organized everything in the background and for setting this up so fantastically. So I'll hope to speak for about 25 minutes or so. The title, as Chad has said, of my presentation today is, Does Grid Collapse Accelerate the Energy Transition? Lessons from Lebanon's electricity crisis. And so here with this first picture that you see, we're in the town of Baalbek in the Lebanese Bekaa Valley on the eastern Mediterranean. It's early spring 2023. We're facing northwest. You can still see the snow-capped mountains of the Lebanon mountain range. And at that time, I'm still doing my dissertation field research, some of which is first sort of findings, early findings I'm presenting to you today. And sort of the broad question of my research or theme is Lebanon's shifting energy landscape. And some of you, I don't know how big your screens are or how good the resolution is, might have already sort of spotted it, spotted the objects of my interest, of my research. which is these many solar panels, some of which I have highlighted on this picture. I didn't get all of them. And the important message or question in a way is that only 2 years ago, you would have not seen a single solar panel from this particular vantage point. And to support this sort of here quite obvious image observation with some more data, on the bottom, I quote a recent World Bank study, also from this spring, which suggests that some 70% of households in this district in Val Bekermel are equipped with solar systems. And on the top, you see a graph with data from the Lebanese Customs Authority. It's the tonnage of solar PV panels unloaded at the port of Beirut. And you see towards the far right corner around the summer of 2021, a lot more solar panels being unloaded in a single month, more than over the entire decade before. This starts on the far left in 2013. So the very sort of maybe simple question at the outset is, what happened? And what happened is that in the summer of 2021, the country experienced a near total blackout, and solar PV for a period became more or less the only means to secure access to electricity. That's why the sort of scramble to these PV panels happened. Here, to sort of as a reminder, or to sort of some news clippings from various agencies. Lebanon has plunged into darkness. This is all in the summer of 2021. Lebanon electricity crisis, a disaster in the making, total power outage here in the national, etc. So one of the things I argue, or try to argue, and we'll discuss it later, is that this summer sort of was or presented a breakdown of a dual energy regime that has been in place since the civil war lasting in Lebanon from 1975 to 1990. And this dual energy regime relied on two different energy sources that most citizens would be connected to. On the one hand, that's a weak state utility with frequent rolling blackouts. And on the other hand, to compensate for these blackouts, some 36,000 neighborhood backup generators, which would have little neighborhood micro monopolies selling electricity to the people that surround them. The state utility in this period from 1990 till 2020, would provide between 15 to 22 hours of electricity per day. It was highly inefficient in the sense that there are huge network losses, 40%. That is both technical losses in the network and losses in terms of unpaid bills and illegal connections. Importantly, and that will be important later, the utility, despite being sort of quite bad at providing electricity, made a huge hole into the budget, around $2 billion of deficit per year, amounting over these last 30 years to some $40 billion in deficit, a big part of the Lebanese debt overall. On the other hand, the private generators, sometimes also referred to as a generator mafia, who were highly profitable. They're formally illegal because Lebanon, because the state utility has a monopoly on selling electricity, but they're politically well connected and thus can operate, and they also operate out of necessity. And the last point here is that they're tremendously polluting, particularly in urban areas. And here, maybe just a little point, these X's I've put over, this is on the left, an aerial view of Zouk power plant just north of Beirut, which in this arrangement would have up to 700 megawatts of capacity, but many of the turbines are not working. Those are all with an X on it. So it's only about able to provide about 100 megawatts at the moment. So this is a point about the aging facilities. So there's this dual system, yet both these systems primarily rely on diesel to make electricity. Now, in the summer of 2021, there was a fuel shortage. This fuel shortage was caused, or was an effect or manifestation of a political and economic crisis that had started in 2019. Here on this image, you see cars on the coastal highways queuing to put petrol in their tanks. And the reason there was a fuel crisis is because the financial crisis led to a massive devaluation of the Lebanese lira. Chad mentioned this already in his introduction. There was a shortage of foreign currency on the side of the government. However, fuel had remained at a subsidized rate. So the state had to pay the difference between the price at the pump and the price in the global market. And because the local currency, the Lebanese lira, had lost some 90 to 97% of its value, the portion of the subsidy became bigger and bigger. So at the time this drone picture was taken of these traffic jams, a liter of petrol would have cost about an equivalent of $3. So this led to delays in fuel imports because the central bank had problems furnishing these dollars to get the fuel. And it also led to an increase in demand because people were hoarding fuel, because if you had dollars, it was very cheap, as well as smuggling it to Syria. So this led to a situation where neither the state utility nor the generators could provide electricity. And as I've mentioned before, solar PV became the only means of securing or having like guaranteed access to electricity. Later that year, in the fall of 2021, the fuel shortage was solved by ending the subsidies. You can see that on this little graph here, that suddenly, like after a long period of exactly the same price, the diesel liter price goes up significantly. So the first observation or argument is that this rapid growth that I've presented with this initial image is driven on the one hand by these shortages, or in the first instance by the shortages, the absence of fuel to power the system, and then in a second by the cost, by the end of fossil fuel subsidies, which made generator operations quite expensive. So what exactly are these solar systems? That's the next part in my presentation here, where I will try to give you a few snapshots of where, in a way, these thousands of tons of solar panels are located now and what they're doing. And the three topics I want to highlight is households, industry, and then thirdly, and that's sort of already pointing to the question of a possible, maybe brighter future, is the question of microgrids. So here, and then you're familiar with this background already. This is an interview I conducted with Hassan and his family. They bought a system that is about 3 kilowatt peak strong, 6 panels, an inverter, 2 lead acid batteries. I wrote here that it's important to note that all these systems are off-grid. So in contrast to my neighbors here in Ithaca, for instance, who have solar panels on their roofs and usually a grid connected, that's they're sending electricity back into the grid. These guys have standalone systems. And you see the sort of second part of this standalone system here and in this hallway, in the electricity room, if you so will, where Hassan is showing me his 2 lead acid batteries that allow the family to use lights and the TV at night. And what he and many others during my interviews would say is that every person has become a state. Kul shakhs sar dawla. The idea that individuals in this context of a failing state infrastructure and a failing state as a whole, each household has to take care of all these services, from private wells to now also electricity. What kind of state you live in then depends to a large extent on your wealth. So here, as a sort of a contrast on a different scale on the socioeconomic level, I have an image of a big villa which sort of stands for the well-to-do, which have up to 60 plus panels. Wealthy people now often drive electric vehicles because they have been traumatized by the horrible experience of standing in endless lines for fuel. And that's the picture I showed you before. And very much on the lower side of things, on the other side of the spectrum, for instance, a Syrian refugee household that relies on, a single solar lamp donated by the UNHCR, and thus being very, very energy poor. To sum this sort of these solar household systems up, these systems manage to insulate households from grid and state failure. That's a positive thing. They have led to big shifts in terms of energy behavior and efficiency on the side of users. So if you look at shops, they're now full with LEDs, with low energy fridges, with energy efficient TVs. And that's a topic that was not there before. However, on the flip side, individualized systems come at a high cost and a high risk to individuals and to households. If something breaks, they're very expensive. It's, according to the World Bank, one of the worst economic crises of the last century. So many people don't have the money to pay the upfront cost for such a system. In this vein, it's important to stress that they perpetuate, and not only perpetuate, but also exacerbate existing inequalities, exacerbating energy access. They also, to some extent, reinforce sociopolitical systems of patronage. That means if you don't have the money, if you're sort of middle or lower class, and you don't have the cash, but you want such a system, you might find assistance through a religious, a political group, and thus also become more dependent on them. And then the final negative point here is that I argue they are both socially and technologically inefficient, because as standalone systems, it's not possible to share excess energy. If you think back to to Hassan standing on that roof, much of the household is out of the house during the day, and they only have 2 batteries, but they have relatively many panels for that. And thus the batteries will be full on a sunny day by 11:30. And so that excess energy that is produced on the roof goes to waste, and they can't share it with their neighbors. Yeah, that's hugely inefficient in contrast to a grid-like situation where this could be distributed. All right, this brings me now to the next sort of theme or area where these panels went, which is industry. Here on your screen, you now see a satellite image, a Google Earth image of the industrial area in the town of Zahle, which is also in the Bekaa Valley, not only like maybe 30 miles south of my opening image. And these blue reflecting surfaces on these factory roofs, those are all solar panels. And the reason these solar panels are there is that many factories and industries have adopted hybrid energy systems after the end of the fossil fuels. The reason behind that is that most businesses and industries already had an in-house power system. They would have between 1 and 10 generators, depending on how much electricity they needed to run their operations. However, the shortages and then the end of the subsidies made this system prohibitively expensive, or prohibitively expensive in many instances. The solution, or the sort of technological fix at the moment, is to hybridize the system. That is, to reduce the amount of generator power during the day by adding solar power, which you put on your roof. And depending on the load profile of an operation, up to 70% of fuel can be saved. Amongst the very interesting aspects of this phenomenon is that some factories I interviewed have changed the rhythm of operation. So for instance, one large food manufacturer used to have day and night shifts, but now, since electricity is, from an operational cost point of view, effectively free during the day, but very, very expensive during the night, he only runs the night shift. Another aspect that is interesting is that these systems are quite effective in the sense that companies told me they would not want to go back to the grid, even if the grid were to come back in full capacity. And that is saying at the current cost of a kilowatt hour. So this is also a recent change after the fuel subsidies ended. The national utility also increased its kilowatt price. What used to be something in the range of, I think, ½ cent per kilowatt hour is now 27 cents. So much more than, for instance, I pay here in Ithaca for my electricity. So the term here is grid defection, that they're no longer interested in the grid. Okay, the third point or question here is whether microgrids might function as a missing link between state and household. And the image you see here is a microgrid in the village of Jaboule, and I'll talk about it more in a second. There are, and again, it's something I think Chad hinted to in the beginning, there's a couple of factors that point towards a convergence of factors that point towards solar microgrids. There are, as I mentioned, these limitations of solar home systems that you can't share, but in a microgrid, you could share. And it would reduce the individual cost. Since you can operate such systems in a more professional way, it reduces risks associated to maintenance, and there's less wastage. Then on the national level, we have continue to have political gridlock for over a year now. The anniversary was just last year. There hasn't been a president. The government is a stand-in government that hasn't been elected. So there's a feeling that there's no near-term fix for the national utility, right? Nothing has changed there for a long time, and there's a kind of a hopelessness. Most people don't think that the grid will come back. Then a third point is there's a lot of experience with microgrids, because these generator operations effectively are small microgrids, and they're quite good at managing it, at least from an economic point of view, because in contrast to the state utility, which is very bad at collecting bills, they're very good. And the final point here, a hypothesis in a way, is that village electrification is a neat project for aid actors, right? In a context of state failure, where it's very complicated to work with the national government, working with a village or a community to improve energy access makes sense, and those are also investments in a scale that are, grantable. Yet there is only one full solar microgrid in the country, and it's this one in the northern Bekaa Valley. On the picture here, I hope you can make that out. This is about the size of a football field. It's a 1 megawatt installation. It has a container full of lithium-ion batteries and 3 small backup generators for the late hours of the night. So why are there so few microgrids? My sort of preliminary findings or arguments here is that there's a contentious politics of decentralization. Providing electrical power is in that sense also about political power, and you can't just show up and become such an actor. So the first point here, I've stated that before, but obviously it's a good reason against these microgrids. The state utility, even though it's largely absent in terms of its electricity, continues to have a monopoly on the distribution of electricity. So the image you saw before, this microgrid in Jaboule, it's illegal. Secondly, the existing diesel generator operators are not particularly interested in this type of competition, right? So for instance, the people who who built the system. They thought they wanted to build it in a different village, but the local generator operator said, not on my turf. And here, the third point is that sectarian and political actors seem to prefer individualized support. I've mentioned this before in my slide about solar home systems, where various charities would be supportive in providing loans or grants for poor households to get access to these systems, but they want that direct connection to individuals. So there's no collective structures. Relatedly, there are concerns about such energy decentralization exacerbating the falling apart, the disintegration of the Lebanese state as a whole, sort of that giving up on the national utility would also mean giving up on a broader project of the Lebanese nation state. And then more sort of concrete from an implementation and financing point of view, there's huge financial risks, particularly at the moment. There's basically no functioning banking system in Lebanon at the moment, which makes it unattractive for private, particularly foreign private investors. And then, because I mentioned foreign aid agencies before, they are trepid about the legality, and they're also fearful about the accusation of regional and sectarial bias of, preferring a particular village. Yet, and this is the last slide on the microgrid, yet these dynamics might be shifting. The old-fashioned generators, at least in a rural area, are dying out because many households have solar systems and thus disconnect. And those who don't have solar systems tend to be so poor that they can't pay the new high fees for generator backup electricity. Okay, so I'm coming to an end. A couple of lessons learned. We can make the case that disruptions of grid and fossil fuel supply chains speed up the adoption of, in this case, decentralized renewable technologies. However, this sort of kind of chaotic way of doing it, where each household has to become a nation, is certainly not a socially viable strategy. Then load management, and there's very interesting observations about load management. This is the story about factories and industry adopting their operations, but also households adopting their way of life to the particular rhythm of renewables, in this case, the course of the sun. The phenomenon of grid defection, which exists not only in Lebanon, but also in a European or US American context, raises important questions about the future viability of a centralized grid. Without these loads, is it even viable to maintain such big infrastructures? Can they ever be profitable, or at least break even? And this leads me sort of to the last point here, is this question of the role of the grid shifting. And in Lebanon, an interesting phenomenon at the household level is that the grid, when it comes on at night, is used as a kind of battery extension, because that is the major constraint, is saving electricity. These were some brief preliminary points. My final slide here is sort of my argument that the dynamics of a global energy transition play out in an extreme form in Lebanon, and that both their utopian and dystopian potential is of relevance, obviously very much to the people who live there, but also beyond. And with that, I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Camillo. That was really fascinating. I just have a quick question, and then obviously we want to get to other people's questions in response to your presentation. You gave us a lot to think about. Do you think that there are examples that exist out there of smaller nations that have been able to leapfrog from a fossil fuel reliant system combined with poor energy infrastructure into something that might look like successful energy transition, even on a micro social level, without exacerbating, existing forms of inequality that you've already been pinpointing are very deeply rooted in Lebanese society. Are there any, because we can't look to the Nordic states here as any kind of paradigm that might be applicable to Lebanon, or maybe you might have a different perspective here.
Yeah, so I don't have a sort of an example of the nation that has successfully leapfrogged. The argument I would make is that on a smaller regional and local scale, we can look for examples across the United States of successful microgrids, for instance, which have high reliability and which largely run on renewables. Such on a town and village level phenomena exist in Europe as well. And to some extent, I would say that, I mean, it's one would twist an arm to present the Lebanese energy crisis in a utopian fashion. But I think some of these, the possibility of this is visible in a place like Lebanon at the moment, amongst other things, because it's so perfectly suited from a climatic and topographical point of view to these technologies. So I would say the good practices, the success stories, they exist. It's not necessarily on a national level, but on a smaller scale. And that's also sort of the story. For instance, I didn't talk too much about this particular microgrid in the north of Lebanon, but that is a good story, right? People's lives there are effectively better. Their meat didn't spoil in the fridge in that period because they continued to have electricity. Neighbors would come and charge their phone. Agriculture doesn't need diesel pumps, or didn't need diesel pumps for irrigation in those periods. So there's sort of many positive aspects, but it's an island that's not yet a systemic national solution that reaches everyone. Yeah, or it was a bit of a winded answer to your first question.
So just looking at some questions here that are coming through. We've got one here from Jonathan Weatherly, who asks, is there any way to co-opt or partner with the monopoly utility? Is there a way that they can receive some kind of commission fee for independent solar systems as a way to remove their resistance?
That's a great question. And sort of it depends who you ask, right? There is it's actually a USAID funded project that tries to do this, to strong arm the national utility into giving preferential electricity access to certain communities if they fund solar panels in that area. This project has not yet started. If you talk to some people, they will tell you it's completely hopeless because the national utility, as you know, Chad, is sort of, again, in a kind of logic of political gridlock where no decision can be made without all political parties and players agreeing. And there will always, there's sort of, the one term is a vitocracy. There's always somebody who will say, no, actually, why is it in this area? Why is it there? We don't want that. So in that sense, the national utility is a complicated institution to work with. What does exist, and what is sort of maybe a lower hanging fruit in terms of hybridization or making a deal, is local generator operators, particularly in areas where there's enough space, so not in city centers, who are interested in going hybrid the way industrial players are going hybrid. So they already have a network and thus would like to cut their diesel costs, which means they can reduce costs to their customers. But there is this stigma of them being like a mafia. This is not true in all instances. Sometimes the municipality operates the generator. And there remains the legal problem. You would need Parliament to make a decision to rescind this monopoly of the state utility. And that's not something that seems likely to happen, at least in the very near future, since basically no decision can be taken for the last years.
We have another question from Omar Farouk, who asks, just wondering if you can add a little bit more about village electrification. Is there any major rural electrification program in Lebanon funded by international development agencies similar to many South Asian countries?
Yeah, thank you, Omar. There is not. I mean, one thing to keep in mind, and maybe I could have pointed out, Lebanon is very small, right? If we compare it to countries on the subcontinent, for instance. So there's also this argument that we don't need kind of an even smaller solution because the whole country is only a couple, not even 400 kilometers long. And there has not been any such initiative because of this monopoly on the state side and because of the sort of economic monopoly of these generators. So this has been, at least in the last years, a very complicated area to enter where you would burn your fingers. What is happening in terms of international funding at the moment is that many NGOs and aid actors are funding, for instance, education facilities, military installations, water, sort of in the wash sector, pumps, both for wastewater and for drinking water. So that's where much of the internationally funded solarization is happening. It's an effort to strengthen institutions that then, or local institutions that then give services to the people who live there. But nobody is funding anything that would be sort of, directly supplying electricity to citizens.
We've got a question from Amanda. I'm not sure if you can see that question in the comment boxes on the right, Camillo. I can read it out if you need to.
I can. Amanda? No, I cannot, unfortunately.
Amanda would like to hear about your future research and how you would see that drawing on the kind of experience that you've gained through your research in Lebanon.
Yeah. So at the moment, I'm trying very hard to write my dissertation based on this last year of field research. The two tracks, and I hope that somehow came through this presentation, is on the one hand, the story of electricity is one way to tell and understand the story of Lebanon, and there's a longer historical story that I didn't go into, and so that's in a way one intellectual or academic impetus, and the other one is this argument of the comparison, right? Where we say so much is unclear about both the economics and the politics and the everyday life of future energy systems. And in settings where things break down and very rapidly change, if we think at how quickly things changed, at least in parts of the Lebanese energy landscape over the last 2 years, these are, I would argue, big lessons, for potential crises happening elsewhere. The US is no stranger to grid collapse and long blackouts that are tremendously expensive and dangerous in many fronts. Fossil fuel supply ruptures have greatly affected the looks of roofs in Europe in the last years since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. So we can see, this is my argument, we can see some of these dynamics exacerbated in Lebanon. And so I think there's things to be learned. So those are the two sort of areas my work is going into, besides the wall I'm facing as a graduate student in terms of trying to finish a dissertation in the coming months.
I think the Lebanese case study is fascinating on several levels, as you pointed to. When we think about the way in which, a kind of extreme form of neoliberalization has played out in Lebanon since the Civil War period.
Yeah.
In the sense that, one of the things that the Civil War did that has been its kind of ongoing legacy is its hollowing out of the state. The state has very little capacity, it has very little legitimacy, and it has very little authority. Those are three kind of core elements of theorization of state power in political science. And if you measure Lebanon in terms of those three categories, you see that it has endemic deficiencies in all three. And as you're suggesting, the electricity crisis, the energy crisis, is not only a reflection of that, but in many ways it's like both a cause and an effect. I think you can think of the kind of institutional failures as being that come out of the hollowing out of the state during the Civil War as leading in many ways to this current situation. Of course, global factors have played a role. You refer to the kind of the war in Ukraine, the pandemic, and of course the financial collapse, which was tied to kind of larger international factors, but again was engineered by entities within Lebanon who essentially were using the Lebanese economy and its currency as part of a Ponzi scheme to inflate the value of the currency.
Yeah.
So I think there's kind of it would seem that the viability of the state, its ability to be reformed in any way, and to provide basic infrastructure. You think the tap water in Lebanon is undrinkable. A lot of the natural resources that should be protected, namely beaches, are heavily polluted. There are efforts to do micro-agricultural forms of tourism, but again, they seem to be aimed in a very decentralized way at elites, right? Whether it's expatriate Lebanese or whether it's elites within the country who can profit from organic, produce, for instance, and certain forms of tourism around that. Do you see any possibility in the absence of reforming these things, reforming the state, of a trickle-down effect happening with solar energy, the importing of solar energy technology, and the possibility of these microgrids seem to me to be a very inefficient and ad hoc way to transition away from reliance on fossil fuels. But is there a possibility that as these panels become more affordable and these markets become change in nature, that we could see something that might be more equitable in the Lebanese landscape? Or do you think that ultimately solar power will be largely controlled by elites?
I think I'm somewhat optimistic. What has happened in terms of the control of the market, since this is the last thing that you mentioned, in few places in the world, I feel is solar power as cheap as it is in Lebanon at the moment. So going back to this initial graph, you can buy a watt peak for around 25 US dollar cents. That's much cheaper than you could certainly in the US or in Europe. And many people have joined this economy. So anybody who is selling or before was selling, TV dishes or working on roofs or working as an electrician, now does this type of stuff. And it's obviously there is a cold side to this, as a sort of a kind of market-driven, crisis-driven transition. And there's people who get left in the dark in a rough way. Yet I would argue that in contrast to some of the highly elite controlled aspects of the economy, and you mentioned some of them, there is a kind of, you know, development state. I make a bit of money by providing the service, and the service is electricity now. That is working, and that is working for people who are mid to lower class. So it's not just the way it used to be before the crisis, where you'd have 5, 6, 7 big companies that would, you know, used to make much of their profits selling electricity infrastructure in Western Africa, and now they also do this stuff at home, and they're super well connected, and they have access to capital. But you also have in every village somebody providing this kind of stuff there. So there I see a kind of developmentalization of Lebanon, and you can see this, you know, in both a good and a bad light, in the sense that it's becoming more like some of its, you know, poorer countries in the region, and it's something that doesn't gel well with a kind of Beiruti urban view of Lebanon as the Switzerland of the Middle East, where everything is, you know, shiny. But the broader global phenomena that solar power is now the cheapest way of making electricity, that's just become true suddenly. And there is, I think, there certainly is very positive environmental aspects to this, and there is sort of, because I see Amanda's question here, there is also an emancipatory potential to this. So I think there are instances of local infrastructures, and I would still continue, whether it's a microgrid or sort of regional electricity, where functioning infrastructure at the local or regional level is also a means of generating sort of infrastructure-based political identities. That would be my sort of my optimistic view of this. And the way that the fossil fuel electricity generation system has taken a hit through this crisis, through this shock, it has created some space for new actors. In some instances, yes, it reproduces an existing system, an existing political economy, but it is also opening up new possibilities. And these haven't yet fully, you know, it's, at least to me, it's not yet fully clear how much momentum they will have, whether they will actually change something. But looking at the bleakness of the overall situation, I would consider this one of the few sectors where you can, in a way, have some legitimate amount of hope.
We've got a few minutes just for some final thoughts, Camillo, that you want to maybe return to, or, you know, offer at this stage that, you know, kind of build up from the discussion, or you weren't able to cover in your presentation.
I think what I just said, I in a way, sort of my last somewhat techno-optimistic argument. I think there is, even if it's maybe, you know, there's maybe a short-sightedness to it, but I think from a scholarly point of view, I try to make that argument that there is obviously, there's a point in looking at the dark side of things, but particularly there is a silver lining in this story, and many people I talk to would stress this, that this was, you know, sort of the one sector of the economy, but also as an activity and action where that has proven fruitful since the political and financial crisis that started in 2019, the horrific explosion of the Beirut port in 2020, and this general feeling also in Lebanon of things just slowly and gradually getting worse every day and every month. Not so, I would argue, in the field of decentralized renewable energy. Many questions and problems, you know, are still unanswered and continue to exist. But yeah, I think that would be my final, my hopeful ending.
That's really great.
Camillo and Chad, thank you so much for a fascinating conversation. I mean, I really appreciate, Camillo, the recognition that it's a qualified statement, right? But that there is emancipatory potential.
Yeah.
In a situation that is, as you say, bleak, but has this very interesting trend, right, that has emerged, right, and that is market oriented. I mean, it's a financial trend, among other things, but it's also, it'll be very interesting to watch, right, in terms of, where that the political dimension of this could go. This notion of infrastructure-based political entities. Really interested. I do hope that I asked that question about what are you planning to do in the future. I do hope that we can sort of revisit this question at some point and see sort of how things continue to play out, because clearly it's at a very early stage in this. There's much to be continued to play out, right, in terms of how the systems will continue to evolve. So thank you both for a really fascinating window into a particular place and time, and how one version, right, of our energy transitions is emerging. This was today's talk, and as you know, we will be continuing our series in January. Stay tuned for updates on our talks in the winter term. We try to do about 2 or 3 of these each 2 or 3 months. And we are excited to continue to bring our New Energy Summer Summit speakers into the mix for our New Energy Talks, and others as well. So if you are a advanced PhD student, a postdoc, or a young faculty member working in energy and society, and you're interested in joining the community of speakers, please give us a shout. We would love to hear from you. So with that, a final thank you to Camillo and Chad, and all best to everyone for a healthy and productive rest of your day and week. Thank you so much for being with us. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.